Under the pale yellow light, Jeff Buckley sang as if it were the last time. Just a few weeks later, he was found drifting quietly in the river in Memphis. No drugs, no violence, only the clothes on his back and his eyes closed, as if he were asleep. All his life, he lived in the shadow of a father who was almost a stranger. At his father's funeral, the chair meant for Jeff sat empty. His name was never mentioned in the obituary. A few days before his death, Jeff received a strange phone call. Someone standing nearby recalled that he stayed silent the entire time, then nodded and quietly said, "I understand." But he never told anyone what that conversation was about. That night, he stepped into the water, sang a few lines, and let the river carry him away. Was it only an accident? Or was there something waiting for him beneath the surface? Something only Jeff knew? Chapter 1. Shut out of his father's funeral and the secret behind the obituary. It was the day of Tim Buckley's funeral. The church was silent, broken only by the sound of footsteps on the cold tile floor. Wooden pews stood in perfect rows, each with a white wreath resting on it. But in the very last row, there was an empty seat. That seat should have been Jeff's. The 8-year-old boy was nowhere to be seen. No one had sent an invitation. His name wasn't even in the obituary. Years later, a family friend would whisper, there was a reason they didn't want the boy there. Not everyone wanted to be reminded that Jeff existed. Outside the church, Tim's old guitar sat in its wooden case, locked tight. Jeff had never been allowed to touch it. That image burned into his memory, a closed door that no one would open for him. Flashback. A few months before the funeral, Mary, Jeff's mother, had taken him to see Tim. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. A dim desk lamp spilled light across scattered sheets of paper. Tim's head was bent low, busy writing. Jeff stood in the doorway, silent, waiting for eye contact, for a question. Nothing. Tim never looked up. The meeting lasted only a few minutes. No hug, no promise to meet again. As Jeff walked away, he glanced back. The guitar leaned against the wall, its shadow stretching long across the floor. After Tim's death, Jeff stayed with Mary and his stepfather, Ron Moorhead. The family moved constantly, from one small California town to another. Jeff would later call that childhood rootless trailer trash, living like nomads with no place to put down roots. Every time you got to know someone, you had to leave, Jeff said in an interview. I learned how to tell who would hit me and who would stand by me. In every rented room, Jeff kept his own guitar propped in a corner. It reminded him of the one that had been locked away in the church, an object that was both a dream and a warning that some things would never belong to him. Ron gave him a copy of Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. That was the first voice I ever loved, Jeff recalled. Still, no matter how much he loved music, he rarely spoke about Tim. A classmate remembered, when he played guitar, Jeff often chose his father's songs. He wouldn't say it, but everyone knew what was on his mind. Mary once said Jeff had always tried to avoid Tim's path, the drugs, the recklessness. Yet he could never truly escape that shadow, because even when he wasn't at the funeral, people still saw him as Tim Buckley's son. The yellow light that day, the empty seat, the locked guitar, they stayed with Jeff for years, seeping into his music, into the way he saw the world. And maybe the question was never whether Tim's shadow left Jeff, but whether it still sat there in the last row at every moment of his life. Chapter 2. His father's memorial and the unconfirmed presence. That morning, the sky was gray and a light rain was falling. People held umbrellas, moving quickly up the church steps for Tim Buckley's funeral. The air was so heavy, you could hear nothing but footsteps and the rain on the roof. And even with his father gone, no one knew for sure if Jeff showed up. Some swore they saw a young man sitting in the last pew. Others insisted he wasn't there at all. The silence around Jeff's name made him almost a ghost in his own family story. Inside, the church glowed with candlelight and colored beams from stained glass windows. The casket stood in the center, surrounded by white flowers. The organ played slow, steady notes, but they only made the room feel heavier. In the far back corner, a young man sat with his head lowered. Half his face was hidden in shadow, If it was Jeff, he had come like a stranger. No one turned to greet him. No one invited him closer. Then, in the middle of the service, a guitar string rang out. The sound wasn't loud, but enough to make a few heads turn. The note hung in the air, long and soft, as if someone had brushed against a memory. At the end of the row, a wooden guitar leaned against the pew, its strings still trembling. The hand that had touched it was gone. No one spoke. The moment faded, but the echo seemed to linger. A musician who once worked with Tim later said that, a few days before the funeral, Jeff had found a small piece of paper slipped under his apartment door. It held only one line. "Come. He wants to hear you sing one more time." No name. No address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Jeff never told anyone about it. He just folded it, slipped it into his coat pocket, and went to work the next day like nothing happened. Strangely, the funeral had no planned performances. No one had asked Jeff to play. If he really did bring a guitar, it stayed by his side, silent, like a quiet witness to his presence. When the service ended, people filed out one by one. Candles still burned on the altar, slow drops of wax falling to the base. The last pew was empty. No one remembered seeing Jeff stand up or walk to the door. Some believe he slipped out while everyone's heads were bowed. Others say he was never there. And so, the question lingers. Was Jeff truly in that church? Or just a shadow people wanted to imagine, to make up for the distance between father and son? Chapter 3. Bowie's Praise and the Mysterious Missing Recording. Jeff had just heard the news. David Bowie had called Grace, the album to take to a desert island. The phone sat on the table. The room was dark, lit only by a single desk lamp, casting its glow over a guitar resting sideways on a chair. Jeff sat still, his fingers brushing lightly across the strings. No smile. No one there to share the moment. Outside, the world was calling his name. Inside, there was only the faint hum of vibrating strings. From late nights singing at the tiny Cine Cafe, Jeff had been pulled into the orbit of Columbia Records. They took him from a rented room in the East Village to stages around the world. In 1993, his Live at Cine EP was released. A year later came Grace. The album didn't explode immediately, but those who listened knew it was something different. Bowie, Dylan, Robert Plant, all praised it. But Jeff didn't like being controlled. He refused to include Forget Her on the album, even though the label believed it was a guaranteed hit. They took him to dinner, tried to persuade him. He still shook his head. "I don't want to sing words I don't believe in." He also frowned when People magazine named him one of the 100 most beautiful people. "Music is what matters," he told a friend. In the studio, his guitar was always within reach. When his focus drifted, he would lean over to tune it, as if reminding himself there was still something he could control. But there were days when he simply disappeared. One recording session, the band sat under the yellow lights, waiting. Minutes ticked by. Jeff's chair stayed empty. A sound engineer adjusted the microphone. The hum of the air conditioner mixed with someone's sigh. When Jeff finally walked in, he just said, "Sorry," and began to play. No one asked questions. No one got an explanation. It felt like he had just stepped out of another world. And then there was the matter of the missing mix. A finished master of Grace vanished from the studio. No one admitted to taking it. The label panicked. The musicians were confused. A week later, it was back, lying neatly on Jeff's desk, spotless, without a trace of dust. One engineer murmured, it was just there, like it had never been gone, as if an invisible hand had put it back. Jeff only smiled and said nothing. To Columbia, Jeff was a brilliant enigma. To his friends, he was warm, yet kept a space no one could cross. A fellow musician once said, he loved freedom more than fame, but once you touch the spotlight, it's hard to walk away. At the end of every show, Jeff followed the same ritual. Place the guitar in its case, lock it, watch the stage lights fade, and let the darkness swallow everything. When a free spirit is locked inside a golden cage, can the strings stay tight forever, or will they one day snap when no one expects it? Chapter 4. The Glory of Grace and the shadows of death. Memphis, early 1997. Jeff left New York in search of a quiet place to work on his second album, My Sweetheart the Drunk. He rented a small house, bringing only a few suitcases and his guitar, always placed neatly in the corner, the way it would be in a studio. By day, he wandered the still streets. By night, the lights in his house stayed on late. His silhouette fell across the curtains, the guitar resting on a chair like a silent companion. But friends began to notice changes. Once, Jeff tried to buy an old house whose owner had never put it up for sale. He knocked on the door, offered to pay on the spot, but was turned down. Days later, he did the same with an old car parked outside a cafe. Again, no one would sell. A friend recalled, he said he wanted to settle somewhere, but his eyes, they looked like he was getting ready to go somewhere very far away. Then, out of nowhere, he proposed to his girlfriend at the time, Joan Wasser. No flowers, no ring, just a question over dinner. Joan laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Jeff stayed silent. A week later, he went to the Memphis Zoo to apply for a job as a keeper in the butterfly exhibit. "I want a normal job," he told the zoo manager. They promised to get back to him, but he never returned for the answer. In the studio, the strange behavior continued. One night, the band was ready. Yellow light spilled across the mixing desk. Jeff's chair sat empty. The microphone was already in place. The tapping of a pen on the table mingled with the hum of the air conditioner. Someone asked, "Where is he?" No one responded. Half an hour later, Jeff walked in. Guitar over his shoulder, strings already tuned. No explanation. He just sat down and began to play, as if he had never been gone. When recording Nightmare by the Sea, one lyric rang out, "Stay with me under these waves tonight." A band member glanced at another, as if silently asking, "What's on his mind?" Years later, fans would gather all of Jeff's water imagery, "Under These Waves," "Poison River Wild," and call them omens. But there was never proof he had any plan in mind. Joan Wasser remembered, "Not long after we met, he told me, 'You know, I'm going to die young.' At the time, she brushed it off. But years later, she could still hear those words in her head. The guitar was always there. In the studio, in his rented home, on every trip. But on May 29th, 1997, when Jeff left the house with Keith Foti, the guitar stayed behind. The living room light in Memphis was still on. The guitar leaned against a chair, its case open, the strings still faintly vibrating, as if someone had just touched them. Why would Jeff leave behind the one thing he had never been without, just before stepping into the night that would seal his fate? Chapter 5. The Last Day, and the Details That Don't Add Up. The evening of May 29th, 1997. Memphis lay under the glow of a late sunset. The surface of the Wolf River was still, mirroring the golden streaks from a distant bridge. Not a breath of wind. Jeff Buckley and Keith Foti were driving, looking for the rehearsal space for the next day's recording session. They got lost. Instead of turning back, Jeff suggested they stop by the riverbank. For the first time, his guitar stayed behind in the rented house, the case open, the strings silent. Jeff stepped down to the narrow strip of sand, still wearing his shirt, jeans, and heavy boots. Keith switched on the radio. Music spilled from a small speaker. Jeff smiled, took off his jacket, and without warning, walked into the water. He began singing Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love. His voice carried into the open air, echoing off the water like rippling waves of sound. Keith sat on the shore, listening, watching the circles of water spread out around Jeff. Far down the river, a tugboat appeared. Its low, steady engine rumbled. The waves grew larger as they rolled in. Keith turned to move the radio away from the water's edge, afraid it would get wet. Only a few seconds. When he looked up, Jeff was gone. Keith called out, but only the sound of waves hitting the shore answered him. He rushed into the water, searching, finding nothing but darkness and the faint glimmer of the tug's lights. Police arrived, sweeping searchlights across the river. A helicopter circled, its beam cutting across the water. But as night fully fell, the search had to stop. In the days that followed, Questions lingered. Why did Jeff go into the water fully clothed and wearing boots? Why choose a stretch of river known for strong undercurrents? And why leave behind his guitar, the one thing he had never been without? No answers came. 6 days later, a passenger aboard the steamboat American Queen spotted his body caught in branches along the riverbank. The coroner's report: no drugs, no alcohol, no signs of struggle. One investigator quietly remarked, "It's as if he never tried to swim back." In the Memphis house, the guitar still leaned against the chair. No dust had settled. The case was open, the interior silent, as if still waiting for the familiar hands that would never return. That night on the Wolf River, was Jeff truly swept away, or did he let himself drift, following an intention that had been there all along? Chapter 6. The official verdict, and the questions that never close. 6 days after Jeff vanished, the waters of the Wolf River still moved slowly. A passenger aboard the American Queen looked down and spotted a figure caught in the branches along the shore. Police pulled him from the water. The coroner's report was clear: no drugs, no alcohol, no signs of struggle. The official cause: accidental drowning. But to his friends, that answer felt far too simple. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Jeff was healthy, energized about his new album. Michael Teague, his friend and bandmate, recalled, he wanted the second album to be completely different from Grace. He said he was going to make music that would scare people. Others weren't convinced. Joan Wasser remembered Jeff once saying, "You know, I'm going to die young." The words had become an unsettling prophecy. Manager Dave Laurie told of a strange encounter 6 years later. In London, he met a psychic who took Jeff's bracelet, closed her eyes, and said, he didn't plan for this to happen, but he didn't fight it either. Dave stood frozen. She added, "It wasn't your fault. Let him go." No one could explain what that meant. Meanwhile, Columbia Records called an emergency meeting, not to mourn, but to discuss releasing a posthumous album. Dave was furious. "Too soon," he said. But Mary Guibert, Jeff's mother, knew that if she didn't take control, her son's music would be commercialized beyond recognition. She stepped in to protect his legacy, overseeing the release of Sketches for My Sweetheart, the Drunk, in 1998. Among those tracks were songs filled with images of water, waves, and darkness. Many fans listened and wondered, who had Jeff written them for? And for which moment in his life? Jeff's guitar was returned to his mother's home in California. The strings were still in place, never retuned. Mary kept it in its wooden case, locked tight. Just as Tim's guitar had been locked away years earlier, now Jeff's had become another door forever closed. A friend who visited once looked at the silent case and said, "Some things no one dares to open because they're afraid of losing the feeling that the person is still here." Was Jeff Buckley simply the victim of a careless moment? Or did he step into the water with a quiet acceptance of what was to come? Epilogue: the legend and the void that cannot be filled. With only one studio album, Jeff Buckley left a mark that many artists spend a lifetime chasing. Grace didn't explode on release, but slowly, it found its way into the hearts of listeners. Jeff's voice, at once fragile and powerful, became unmistakable. His rendition of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah now plays at weddings, funerals, and moments when people need a sound to speak the feelings they cannot put into words. Friends say Jeff longed for an ordinary life. He wanted a home, a job, and the freedom to write music on his own terms. But the world turned him into an icon he may never have wanted to be. The irony is, the very things that made Jeff extraordinary, his sensitivity, his perfectionism, his refusal to compromise, were the same things that made it hard for him to find his place in an industry that thrives on conformity. His death, though officially ruled an accident, left cracks that have never fully healed. There are words, songs, and silences in the studio that make people wonder, did he know something was coming? The psychic in London, Joan Wasser's haunting recollection, the lyrics about waves and water, they are fragments of a larger picture. Put together, they form an incomplete image, leaving the viewer to decide what the truth might be. Mary Guibert, Jeff's mother, still keeps her son's guitar locked inside its wooden case. It sits there like a reminder that some doors, once closed, are only meant to be looked at from the outside. Like Tim's guitar years before, Jeff's now rests in silence. But this time, no one is waiting for it to play again. Jeff's legacy is not only in his music, it's in the way he lived, pouring himself into every note, regardless of the cost. In his willingness to say no to what he didn't believe in. In his acceptance of the price of creative freedom. In this world, there are deaths we can easily accept, and there are deaths that remain, like questions never answered. Jeff Buckley belongs to the second kind. Maybe he was simply swept away in a careless moment. Or maybe, as the psychic suggested, he didn't resist. But one thing is certain. That night on the Wolf River wrote the final chapter of his story and left a void that his music will never be able to fill. Did Jeff Buckley truly leave us that day? Or is he still here, in every vibration of the strings, waiting for someone to listen closely enough